You think you hold all the power until the universe flips the script. Picture a dark, desolate gas station off Interstate 85. Two overly confident deputies decide to harass a quiet black woman pumping gas, completely unaware that the badge they hide behind is nothing compared to the gavel she wields. They cuffed her. They mocked her. But less than 12 hours later, they would have to stand in a packed courtroom, look up at the towering oak bench, and call her, Your Honor. The rain was coming down in sharp, freezing sheets that November night, slicking the asphalt of the old Sunoco station on the desolate edge of the county line. It was 11:45 p.m. Valerie Dawson just wanted to get home. At 48, Valerie had spent over 2 decades fighting in the trenches of the legal system, first as a relentless public defender, then as a razor-sharp prosecutor. And as of 3 weeks ago, she had been sworn in as the newest district court judge for the 14th Judicial Circuit. But tonight, she wasn't wrapped in her black silk robe. She was exhausted, wearing oversized grey sweatpants, a faded college hoodie, and her hair pulled back into a messy bun. She was driving her husband's late-model Mercedes-Benz SUV, heading back from a grueling, emotionally draining visit with her ailing mother in the neighboring state. She stood under the flickering fluorescent canopy of the gas station, watching the numbers on the pump tick upward. The rhythmic ding of the unleaded fuel flowing into the tank was the only sound over the relentless rain. That is, until the heavy crunch of tires on wet gravel cut through the white noise. A county sheriff's cruiser rolled into the lot, its headlights cutting aggressively through the downpour. It didn't just pull in, it prowled, sweeping a slow, predatory arc, before coming to a sudden halt directly behind Valerie's Mercedes, blocking her in completely. Valerie's pulse hitched, an instinct born of years of studying the very system she now presided over, but she kept her breathing steady. She didn't turn around immediately. She placed the gas nozzle back into its holster, securing the gas cap with a solid click. The heavy thud of 2 car doors slamming echoed through the damp air. Deputies Wyatt Lawson and Derek Shaw stepped out into the rain. They were young, built like linebackers, and carried themselves with the kind of untouchable arrogance that often festered in the quiet, unmonitored corners of rural law enforcement. Lawson rested his hand casually on the butt of his service weapon, a textbook intimidation tactic, while Shaw clicked on a high-powered maglite, shining its blinding beam directly into Valerie's face. "Is there a problem, officers?" Valerie asked, raising a hand to shield her eyes from the blinding glare. Her voice was steady, modulated with the calm authority she used in the courtroom, though stripped of its formal polish. "Step away from the vehicle," Lawson ordered, his voice a low, gravelly bark. "I'm just pumping gas," Valerie replied, standing her ground beside the driver's side door. "You're blocking my car. Have I committed a traffic violation?" Shaw stepped closer, the beam of his flashlight dropping to illuminate the slick Mercedes logo on the grille, then panning back up to her faded hoodie. The contrast was all he needed to build his internal, flawed narrative. "I said, step away from the car. Now. Let's see some ID." "On what grounds?" Valerie asked. She wasn't being belligerent. She was genuinely demanding the legal threshold required for a stop. Under the Fourth Amendment, you need reasonable, articulable suspicion that a crime has been, is being, or is about to be committed to demand my identification in a non-traffic stop. "What is your suspicion?" Lawson chuckled, a harsh, dismissive sound that grated against the rain. He stepped fully into the light. "Oh, we got a roadside lawyer here, Shaw, a real constitutional scholar." He closed the distance, stopping mere inches from Valerie. The smell of stale coffee and stale tobacco radiated off him. "My suspicion, lady, is that a woman dressed like a vagrant is driving an $80,000 vehicle in an area known for auto thefts. Now, hand over the license before we escalate this. Valerie felt the cold prickle of anger at the back of her neck. This was it. The exact profiling she had spent her career dismantling, happening to her in real time. The vehicle is registered to my husband, Dr. William Dawson, Valerie said, her voice dropping an octave, turning ice cold. If you run the plates, which you clearly haven't done, you will see that it is registered to our home address, which is 15 miles from here. I am happy to provide my identification once you articulate a lawful reason for this detainment. Until then, am I free to go? You're not going anywhere, Shaw snapped, stepping up beside his partner. You're acting defensive. People who aren't hiding anything don't quote laws at us. Turn around and put your hands on the vehicle. Valerie's mind raced. She could end this in 2 seconds. She could reach into her pocket, pull out her judicial credentials, and watch these 2 deputies pale and stammer their apologies. She could pull rank. She could crush them with a single phone call to Captain James Monroe, the precinct commander she had worked with for years. But as she looked into Lawson's sneering face, a profound realization washed over her. If I pull out my badge, I am saved. But what happens to the woman who doesn't have a badge? What happens to the teenage boy, the single mother, the weary night shift worker who stands exactly where I am standing, facing this exact same terror? She needed to see the bottom of the barrel. She needed to let them show her exactly who they were when they thought no one of consequence was watching. I will not place my hands on the vehicle, Valerie said firmly, though she kept her hands entirely visible, palms open and empty by her sides. I have broken no laws. This is an unlawful detainment. Lawson lunged. Before Valerie could take a breath, Lawson grabbed her left arm, twisting it forcefully behind her back. The sudden, agonizing jolt of pain shot up to her shoulder. She gasped, stumbling forward as her chest was slammed against the cold, wet metal of her own car. "Stop resisting! Stop resisting!" Shaw began yelling, despite Valerie standing perfectly still, trapped against the car. "I am not resisting," Valerie said through gritted teeth, her cheek pressed against the freezing, rain-slicked window of the SUV. The heavy metallic ratchet of handcuffs sounded in the night. The cold steel bit brutally into her wrists as Lawson clamped them down, far tighter than necessary. They were squeezing her median nerve, sending sharp, electric pains shooting down into her fingertips. "You're under arrest for obstructing a law enforcement officer and resisting arrest," Lawson whispered near her ear, his breath hot and unpleasant. "Let's see how much law you want to quote from the back of a squad car." They patted her down roughly, pulling her wallet and keys from her sweatpants pocket. Shaw tossed them onto the hood of the cruiser without looking inside the wallet. They didn't even bother to open it, to check her ID. They had their suspect. The narrative was written. As they shoved her into the back of the cramped, smelling police cruiser, the hard plastic seat digging into her back, Valerie Dawson looked through the wire mesh partition. Her wrists throbbed. Her shoulder ached. But in the darkness of the back seat, her eyes were burning with a quiet, terrifying clarity. Let the game begin, she thought. The ride to the county precinct took 25 minutes, though in the claustrophobic darkness of the cruiser, it felt like hours. The heavy partition separating the front seats from the holding area did little to muffle the deputy's laughter. "Did you hear her trying to sound all educated?" Shaw mocked from the passenger seat, tapping the dashboard to the rhythm of the radio. "Fourth Amendment this, articulable suspicion that. They watch one episode of Law and Order and think they're Johnny Cochran. She's going to be singing a different tune when we dump her in holding," Lawson replied, steering the cruiser around a dark bend. "Typical. Probably stole the keys from wherever she cleans houses." In the back, Valerie sat in total silence. She leaned her head against the reinforced glass, watching the blurry streetlights streak by through the rain. The physical pain in her wrists was excruciating. Lawson had intentionally bypassed the double lock mechanism on the cuffs, meaning every time she moved even a fraction of an inch, the steel teeth ratcheted tighter against her bone. Yet, she refused to make a sound. She refused to give them the satisfaction of a grimace or a groan. Every word they spoke, every insult they threw, she mentally recorded. State versus Lawson and Shaw. The file in her mind was growing thicker by the mile. When they finally pulled into the loading bay of the county precinct, the stark, unforgiving glow of industrial halogen lights flooded the car. Lawson yanked her out by the chain of her handcuffs, pulling her off balance so she stumbled onto the wet concrete. "Walk," he commanded, shoving her toward the heavy steel doors. The intake area was a sensory assault. It smelled of bleach, stale sweat, and despair. Phones rang incessantly. Other officers milled about, completely ignoring the blatant manhandling of a citizen in their midst. It was an assembly line of human misery, and Valerie was just another piece of meat on the conveyor belt. They dragged her to the booking desk. The intake officer, a bored-looking sergeant with a thick mustache, didn't even look up from his computer monitor. "What do we got?" the sergeant muttered, typing lethargically. "Obstruction, resisting arrest, suspected auto theft. Though we haven't confirmed the theft yet." Lawson rattled off, slapping Valerie's wallet onto the counter. Refused to ID herself. "All right, empty her pockets. Take the jewelry," the sergeant droned. Shaw roughly pulled off Valerie's simple gold wedding band, dropping it into a manila envelope. Then he opened her wallet. Valerie watched Shaw's face closely. This was the moment. Her judicial credentials, a heavy brass shield embedded in leather, were tucked into the secondary flap, but her standard driver's license was right up front. Shaw pulled out the license. He glanced at it, typed the name Valerie Dawson into his terminal to check for warrants. He didn't recognize the name. In a county of 2 million people, the name of a newly appointed judge didn't mean anything to a low-level deputy who only paid attention to sports and his own ego. He never checked the second flap. He never saw the gold seal of the state judiciary. "No warrants," Shaw grunted. "Address matches the registration on the Mercedes. Guess she didn't steal it." "Doesn't matter," Lawson sneered. "She still caught the obstruction charge. Process her." Valerie was fingerprinted, her hands guided aggressively by the booking officer. She was forced to stand against the wall for a mugshot, the bright flash capturing her exhausted face, her disheveled hair, and the piercing, unyielding fire in her dark eyes. Then, the heavy steel door of holding cell B clanged shut behind her. The cell was freezing. The cinder-block walls radiated a damp chill that seeped immediately through her thin hoodie. There was a single metal bench bolted to the wall, and a stainless steel toilet in the corner without a partition. 2 other women were in the cell, one sleeping curled up on the hard floor, the other pacing and muttering to herself. Valerie sat on the cold metal bench. She rubbed her bruised wrists, feeling the deep indentations left by the steel cuffs. She was a judge. She was a woman who could command a room of high-powered attorneys with a single look. Yet here, she was nothing. Stripped of her title, stripped of her context, she was just another body in a cage. She sat in that cell for 4 hours. She listened to the guards outside making cruel jokes about the inmates. She listened to the desperate pleas of people asking for their phone calls, being ignored or mocked. She absorbed the systemic rot that she had spent her career trying to fight from the top down, now experiencing it from the very bottom. At 4:15 a.m., a sharp voice cut through the dull murmur of the precinct. "I need to see my client immediately, and I need the shift commander out here right the hell now." Valerie allowed a small, tired smile to touch her lips. Samuel Reed wasn't just a defense attorney. He was a shark, a partner at one of the city's most ruthless litigation firms, and one of Valerie's oldest friends from law school. She had used her one allotted phone call an hour ago to call his emergency line. Footsteps echoed down the corridor outside the holding cell. The small viewing window slid open, and the intake sergeant peered in, looking slightly pale. The heavy door unlocked with a loud clank. Samuel stepped in. He was wearing a perfectly tailored navy suit, despite the ungodly hour, his briefcase gripped tightly in his hand. He looked at Valerie sitting on the metal bench, taking in her bruised wrists, her messy hair, her exhausted posture. His jaw tightened so hard, a muscle twitched in his cheek. He opened his mouth to speak, to yell, to demand the badge numbers of every officer in the building. Valerie caught his eye. She gave a microscopic shake of her head. Not yet. Samuel was a master reader of the room. He instantly swallowed his outrage, his face smoothing into a mask of professional annoyance. "Miss Dawson," Samuel said formally, playing along, "I have posted your bond. The charges are misdemeanor obstruction. We will handle this in court." As they walked out to the intake desk to retrieve her belongings, Lawson and Shaw were standing by the coffee machine, watching them. "Look who got bailed out," Lawson smirked, sipping his coffee. "Better tell your client to learn some manners before her court date, counselor. Judge isn't going to like her attitude." Samuel stopped. He slowly turned his head to look at Lawson. The urge to verbally eviscerate the deputy was practically vibrating off him, but Valerie placed a gentle, restraining hand on his arm. "Oh, I wouldn't worry about the judge," Valerie said softly, her voice carrying across the quiet precinct. "I have a feeling the judge is going to be incredibly attentive to every single detail of this case." Lawson scoffed, turning back to his partner. "Whatever, crazy." Valerie walked out into the freezing pre-dawn air, the heavy precinct doors closing behind her. The rain had stopped, leaving the world washed clean and shivering in the dark. "Valerie," Samuel breathed as soon as they reached his car, his composure finally cracking. "Look at your wrists. I'm calling Captain Monroe right now. I'm having those two bastards stripped of their badges before breakfast." "No, Samuel," Valerie said, sliding into the passenger seat. The heater washed over her frozen body. "Captain Monroe handles internal affairs. Internal affairs leads to paid administrative leave, union reps, and quiet resignations. They'll just move to another county and do it again." She turned to look at him, the harsh streetlight illuminating the absolute resolve in her face. "I don't want them fired quietly," she said. "I want them to walk into the light. What time is my docket this morning?" Samuel looked at his watch, a slow, predatory grin spreading across his face as he realized what she was planning. "Court calls at 8:30 a.m., Your Honor. And looking at the county schedule, Deputies Lawson and Shaw are scheduled to testify in Courtroom 4B on 3 different misdemeanor arrests." "Courtroom 4B," Valerie murmured, leaning her head back against the leather seat. "My courtroom." The courthouse was a monolithic structure of limestone and glass, a monument to order and consequence in the center of the city. By 8:15 a.m., the hallways were teeming with the usual morning chaos: anxious defendants in ill-fitting suits, overworked public defenders juggling overflowing manila folders, and police officers leaning against the walls, drinking terrible courthouse coffee and swapping war stories. Deputies Wyatt Lawson and Derek Shaw were among them, standing outside the heavy mahogany double doors of Courtroom 4B. They were in full Class A uniforms, their badges polished to a mirror shine, their utility belts heavy with the tools of their authority. They looked crisp, professional, and entirely unbothered by the events of the previous night. "Man, I hate testifying on traffic misdemeanors," Shaw complained, scrolling through his phone. "Waste of time. We should be out on patrol." "Easy overtime," Lawson shrugged, checking his reflection in the glass of the door. "Plus, I hear the new judge in 4B is a stickler for protocol. We go in, say our piece, get the conviction, and get out. Easy money." Inside the judge's chambers, tucked away behind the courtroom, the atmosphere was entirely different. Valerie Dawson stood in front of the full-length mirror. The exhausted, bruised woman in the faded hoodie was gone. In her place stood the Honorable Judge Dawson. She was wearing her thick, black judicial robe, the heavy fabric cascading to her ankles. Her hair was pulled back into a flawless, severe French twist. Her posture was ramrod straight. The only evidence of the night before was the faint, purplish bruising around her wrists, which she deliberately chose not to cover with a watch or bracelets. Her clerk, a bright-eyed young woman named Abigail, tapped lightly on the open door. "Judge Dawson, the docket is full this morning. Bailiff says the gallery is packed. Are we ready to call court?" Valerie turned away from the mirror. She picked up her thick stack of case files, her fingers resting lightly on the heavy wooden gavel sitting on her desk. "I am perfectly ready, Abigail," Valerie said, her voice smooth as dark glass. "Let's proceed." At precisely 8:30 a.m., the heavy wooden door leading to the bench swung open. "All rise," the bailiff boomed, his voice echoing off the high acoustic ceilings of the courtroom. The dull roar of conversation instantly died. Every person in the gallery, the prosecution tables, and the defense stands got to their feet. "The District Court of the 14th Judicial Circuit is now in session. The Honorable Judge Valerie Dawson presiding. God save the state, and this honorable court." Lawson and Shaw stood in the back row of the gallery, their hands clasped professionally in front of them. They weren't really paying attention. They were looking at the floor, waiting for the ritual to end so they could sit down. Valerie ascended the 3 steps to the bench. She took her seat in the high-backed leather chair, looking out over the sea of faces. Her eyes immediately locked onto the 2 deputies in the back row. "You may be seated," Valerie said. Her voice, amplified by the microphone on her desk, resonated through the room with absolute authority. In the back row, Lawson sat down, letting out a quiet breath. He casually glanced up at the bench to size up the new judge. His eyes traveled up the black robe, up to the collar, up to the face. Lawson froze. All the blood drained from his face with such sudden violence he felt dizzy. His jaw went slack. He blinked hard, once, twice, convinced his eyes were playing a trick on him. He gripped the wooden pew in front of him, his knuckles turning stark white. Beside him, Shaw was whispering something about getting lunch after this. But Lawson didn't hear him. "Shaw!" Lawson choked out, his voice a strained, panicked wheeze. He elbowed his partner sharply in the ribs. "Shaw, look!" Shaw looked up, annoyed. "What, man?" The words died in his throat. Shaw's eyes bulged. The swagger evaporated from his posture, replaced by a cold, paralyzing terror that gripped him by the spine. Sitting on the bench, looking down at them like an apex predator evaluating a wounded animal, was the woman they had violently shoved against a Mercedes 12 hours ago. The woman they had mocked, degraded, and locked in a freezing cinder-block cell. The woman whose wrists they had bruised. Valerie didn't look away from them. She maintained eye contact for 3 agonizingly long seconds. She let the silence stretch in the courtroom, letting the sheer, unadulterated panic marinate in the deputies' souls. She didn't smile. She didn't frown. Her face was an impenetrable mask of absolute power. She slowly raised her hands, placing them deliberately on the bench in front of her. She adjusted the microphone. As she did, the sleeve of her robe slipped back just an inch, exposing the angry, dark, purple bruises encircling her left wrist. Lawson felt bile rise in the back of his throat. He thought he might actually vomit right there in the pew. "Good morning," Judge Dawson addressed the courtroom, her voice steady and perfectly calm, though her eyes never left Lawson and Shaw. "We have a crowded docket today. I expect total adherence to the law, procedure, and the constitutional rights of every citizen in this room. We will tolerate nothing less in my courtroom." She opened the first file. "Bailiff," Valerie said, her gaze finally dropping to the paperwork, though the tension in the room was so thick it was suffocating. "Call the first case." The bailiff cleared his throat. "State versus Marcus. State versus Miller. Traffic misdemeanor. Arresting officers, Deputies Wyatt Lawson and Derek Shaw." Valerie looked back up. She leaned forward, resting her elbows on the bench, interlacing her fingers. "Deputies Lawson and Shaw," Judge Dawson called out, her voice dripping with dangerous, silken courtesy. "Please step forward. The court is very eager to hear your testimony." The walk from the back of the gallery to the front of courtroom 4B was only about 40 feet. For Deputy Wyatt Lawson, it felt like a forced march to the gallows. His heavy black boots, which normally struck the linoleum with a heavy, authoritative thud, now seemed to drag, squeaking awkwardly in the suffocating silence of the room. Beside him, Deputy Derek Shaw looked as though he had been entirely hollowed out, his complexion the color of dirty ash. Every eye in the gallery was on them, sensing the sudden, inexplicable shift in the atmospheric pressure. The veteran court reporters, the cynical public defenders, even the bailiff. They all felt it. A heavy, palpable dread was radiating from the two deputies, clashing violently with the absolute, freezing calm emanating from the bench. "Raise your right hand," the bailiff instructed, as Lawson took his place in the wooden witness box. "Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? So help you God?" Lawson's throat bobbed. He tried to swallow, but his mouth was like sandpaper. "I do," he croaked, the sound frail and reedy, completely devoid of the gravelly bark he had weaponized just hours prior. Judge Valerie Dawson sat perfectly still, her hand steepled beneath her chin, her dark eyes bored into him, completely unblinking. "Proceed, Mr. Thompson," Valerie instructed the prosecutor. Bradley Thompson, a young assistant district attorney who was completely oblivious to the undercurrent of terror in the room, stood up and straightened his suit jacket. "Thank you, Your Honor. Deputy Lawson, could you please recount the events leading to the arrest of the defendant, Mr. Ethan Chambers, on the night of October 12th? Lawson gripped the edges of the witness stand. His knuckles were white. He forced his eyes to remain on the prosecutor, terrified that if he looked to his left, he would meet the gaze of the woman he had unlawfully caged. Yes, Deputy Shaw and I were on routine patrol in the warehouse district," Lawson stammered, reading from his notes, though his hands were shaking so badly the paper rattled against the microphone. "We observed the defendant's vehicle, a 2014 Honda Civic, with a busted passenger-side tail light. We initiated a traffic stop." "And what happened when you approached the vehicle?" Thompson prompted. "The defendant was acting defensive, uncooperative," Lawson said. The words tasted like ash in his mouth. Every syllable he spoke felt like a trap, springing shut. From the bench, Valerie leaned forward. The leather of her chair creaked, a sound that cracked like a whip in the silent courtroom. "Deputy Lawson," Judge Dawson interrupted, her voice smooth, dangerously polite, and echoing ominously through the sound system. "Define defensive. The court needs you to articulate exactly what behavior Mr. Chambers exhibited that led you to believe criminal activity was afoot." Lawson flinched. The sweat that had been beading at his hairline finally broke, a single cold drop rolling down his temple. He was questioning the stop, Your Honor. He was asking why he was being pulled over before I even got to the window." "I see," Valerie said slowly, letting the silence stretch out to an agonizing length. "And is it your training, Deputy, that a citizen asking a law enforcement officer for the legal justification of a detainment is an indicator of criminality?" "No, Your Honor, but it was his tone. He was quoting the law. He said we had no probable cause to search his car." Lawson's voice hitched. He realized too late exactly what he was saying. The parallel was unavoidable. It was the exact same justification he had used to rip Valerie Dawson out of the rain. He quoted the law, Valerie repeated. She turned her head slowly, her gaze sweeping from Lawson in the witness box to Shaw, who was trembling in the front row of the gallery. He knew his constitutional rights, and he verbally asserted them. And you interpreted his knowledge of the Fourth Amendment as reasonable suspicion to escalate the encounter. Is that correct, Deputy? That's not what I meant, Your Honor, Lawson stammered, his chest tightening. He looked at the prosecutor, silently begging for an objection. But Thompson was looking at him with deep confusion. Then explain what you meant, Deputy, Valerie commanded, her voice dropping an octave, losing its polite veneer and exposing the hardened, razor-sharp steel beneath. Because according to your own sworn police report, which I have right in front of me, you used this defensive quoting of laws to order Mr. Chambers out of his vehicle, place him in handcuffs, and conduct a warrantless search of his car without his consent. You claimed exigent circumstances. What were they? Lawson was drowning. The walls of the courtroom felt like they were closing in. He was resisting, Your Honor. Resisting? Valerie's eyebrows arched. She lifted her left hand, adjusting a stack of papers. The sleeve of her black robe fell back again, giving Lawson a clear, unobstructed view of the dark, violent bruising encircling her wrist. Did he physically assault you, Deputy? Did he attempt to flee? Or was he standing perfectly still, with his hands visible, while you twisted his arm behind his back and ratcheted a pair of steel handcuffs into his median nerve? A collective gasp echoed through the courtroom. The public defender, Sarah Linwood, dropped her pen. Prosecutor Thompson's mouth fell open. They all suddenly realized this was no longer a routine hearing. The judge wasn't just cross-examining a witness. She was dismantling him with surgical, terrifying precision. Lawson's breath came in short, hyperventilating gasps. He couldn't speak. He looked at the bruises on her wrist, then back to her unyielding eyes. Lawson stuttered, his bravado entirely shattered. Because if an officer, Valerie continued, her voice echoing off the high acoustic ceiling, were to intentionally bypass the double lock mechanism on a pair of handcuffs, purely to inflict pain on a non-violent, compliant citizen, well, that wouldn't just be poor police work, would it, Deputy Lawson? That would be battery under the color of law, a federal civil rights violation. Wouldn't you agree? Lawson closed his eyes. He felt a tear of pure, unadulterated panic slip down his cheek. Yes, Your Honor, he whispered. Speak into the microphone, Deputy. For the record, Valerie commanded. Yes, Your Honor, Lawson choked out, the microphone catching the wet, ragged sound of a man completely broken. Valerie stared at him for a long, heavy moment. Then she slammed her gavel down with a deafening crack. The court finds that the arresting officers lacked reasonable, articulable suspicion to detain and search the defendant, Valerie announced, her voice ringing with absolute finality. The search was unlawful. The fruits of that search are inadmissible. Case dismissed with prejudice. Mr. Chambers, you are free to go. The young defendant looked stunned, but his attorney quickly ushered him out of the defense box. Lawson pushed himself back from the witness stand, his legs shaking so badly he could barely stand. He looked at Judge Dawson, his eyes wide with a desperate plea. Are we dismissed, Your Honor? Valerie leaned back in her high leather chair. The terrifying stillness returned to her face. Not quite, Deputy, she said softly. Bailiff, secure the doors to the courtroom. No one leaves. The heavy wooden double doors at the back of the courtroom slammed shut with a loud, echoing thud. The bailiff, sensing the gravity of the moment, locked the deadbolt and stood at attention, his hand resting casually on his duty belt. A heavy, suffocating silence descended over courtroom 4B. The gallery, packed with lawyers, clerks, and citizens, was absolutely motionless. Nobody checked their phones. Nobody whispered. They were all captivated by the unfolding spectacle, watching a powerful predator play with its prey. Lawson stood frozen beside the witness box. In the front row, Shaw had buried his face in his hands, his shoulders trembling violently. "Before we proceed with the rest of the morning's docket," Judge Dawson said, her voice projecting clearly across the room, "this court has a pressing matter regarding the integrity of the judicial process and the conduct of the law enforcement officers sworn to uphold it within this jurisdiction." She looked toward the side entrance of the courtroom, the door reserved for court staff and high-ranking officials. "Captain Monroe, you may enter." The door swung open, and Captain James Monroe, the precinct commander for the county sheriff's department, stepped into the room. He was a tall, imposing man with silver hair and a deeply lined face that spoke of 30 years in law enforcement. He was wearing his formal dress uniform, but his expression was grim, furious, and radiating a cold, restrained anger. Tucked tightly under his left arm was a thick manila folder, and in his right hand he held a secure, encrypted digital tablet. Lawson's knees buckled slightly at the sight of his commanding officer. He reached out to grab the wooden rail of the witness box to keep himself from collapsing. Monroe didn't even look at Lawson or Shaw. He walked straight past them, his face carved from stone, and stopped at the bench, handing the manila folder up to Valerie's clerk, Abigail. "Thank you, Captain," Valerie said, nodding gracefully. "Has the evidence been secured?" "Yes, Your Honor," Captain Monroe replied, his deep voice carrying a razor-sharp edge. "Per your emergency judicial order issued at 5:15 a.m. this morning, Internal Affairs has seized the patrol cruiser assigned to Deputies Lawson and Shaw. We have fully extracted all dash camera footage, internal cabin audio, and precinct holding cell video from the hours of 11 p.m. yesterday to 5 a.m. this morning." A collective murmur ripped through the gallery. Prosecutor Thompson looked back and forth between the judge, the captain, and the two terrified deputies, the pieces finally snapping together in his mind. "Excellent," Valerie said. She opened the manila folder, extracting several sheets of official department paperwork. She looked down at Lawson, who was now visibly crying, silent tears streaking down his pale face. "You see, Deputy Lawson," Valerie began, her tone conversational, but laced with lethal intent. "When a citizen is stripped of their rights, assaulted in the rain, and thrown into a freezing cinder-block cell for the crime of pumping gas while black, they usually have a very difficult time finding justice. It often comes down to their word against the sworn testimony of two officers in uniform. And historically, the badge wins." She stood up from her chair. She didn't often stand while presiding, but the moment demanded the full, towering presence of her authority. She stepped to the edge of the bench, looking down at the two men who had tormented her. "But you made a catastrophic miscalculation last night," Valerie said, her voice vibrating with righteous, unyielding fury. "You didn't just arrest a citizen, you arrested the system. You laid hands on the very scales of justice because your arrogance convinced you that in the dark, without witnesses, you were gods." She gestured toward the tablet in Captain Monroe's hand. "I don't need to play the audio for the court. I lived it," Valerie continued. "I remember the smell of your stale coffee, Deputy Lawson, when you whispered in my ear. I remember the exact metallic sound of the handcuffs ratcheting down on my wrists while I was slammed against my own vehicle. I remember you, Deputy Shaw, tossing my wallet without bothering to look at the judicial credentials tucked inside, because you had already decided what I was before you even stepped out of your cruiser." Shaw let out a pathetic, stifled sob from the gallery. "I sat in your holding cell for 4 hours, Valerie said, her voice dropping to a fierce, haunting whisper that commanded the absolute silence of the room. And in those 4 hours, I didn't think about myself. I thought about every single person who has stood exactly where Mr. Chambers stood today. The people who didn't have a law degree. The people who couldn't call a high-powered attorney at 4 in the morning to post their bail. The people whose lives you have casually destroyed just to inflate your own fragile egos. She looked back to Captain Monroe. Captain, based on the unedited video and audio evidence you reviewed this morning, what are your findings? Monroe turned slowly, finally looking at his two deputies. The absolute disgust in his eyes was devastating. Deputies Lawson and Shaw committed multiple violations of departmental policy, Monroe stated, his voice booming with military precision, including unlawful detainment, failure to establish probable cause, false arrest, and excessive use of force. Furthermore, the audio recordings clearly indicate malicious intent and racial profiling. As of 7 a.m. this morning, both deputies have been stripped of their police powers, their badges, and their firearms. "And the criminal charges, Captain?" Valerie asked, her eyes never leaving Lawson. "The District Attorney's Public Integrity Unit is drafting warrants, as we speak, for aggravated assault under the color of law, official misconduct, and deprivation of civil rights," Monroe confirmed. Valerie nodded slowly. She sat back down in her leather chair, the heavy black robe settling around her. She looked at the two men, broken and ruined, standing in the wreckage of their own making. They weren't arrogant predators anymore. They were just small, pathetic men facing the terrifying machinery of consequence. "You mocked me last night," Valerie said quietly. "You laughed and asked how much law I wanted to quote from the back of a squad car. You told my attorney that I needed to learn some manners before I faced the judge." She picked up her heavy wooden gavel. She held it suspended in the air for a fraction of a second, letting the weight of the moment press down on the room. "Well, deputies," Judge Dawson said, her dark eyes flashing with cold, absolute triumph. "The judge is here, and she is completely out of patience." The gavel slammed down. "Bailiff, take these men into custody." The command hung in the stifling air of courtroom 4B, an immovable decree that fundamentally altered the gravitational pull of the room. Bailiff John Decker, a burly, no-nonsense veteran of the courts, didn't hesitate. He stepped forward, unclipping the heavy steel handcuffs from his leather duty belt. The metallic clink was deafening in the absolute silence. "Hands behind your backs," Decker ordered, his voice devoid of any sympathy for his fellow men in uniform. He grabbed Lawson by the bicep, spinning the terrified man around with the exact same rough, unceremonious force Lawson had used on Valerie Dawson just 12 hours prior. "Wait, please, Your Honor, please," Lawson gasped, his voice cracking into a high, desperate pitch. The reality of the moment was crushing his chest, squeezing the air from his lungs. "I have a family. I have a pension. It was a mistake, a terrible misunderstanding. Please, Judge Dawson, I'm begging you." Valerie did not blink. She leaned forward slightly, her dark eyes reflecting nothing but the cold, pristine geometry of the law. "You did not mistake the law last night, Mr. Lawson," Valerie said, intentionally stripping him of his title. "You ignored it. And when you strip a citizen of their humanity for your own amusement, you forfeit the right to demand mercy from the very system you corrupted." "Turn around." Decker ratcheted the steel cuffs onto Lawson's wrists. The sharp, mechanical click, click, click echoed off the limestone walls. It was the exact same sound that had haunted Valerie in the freezing rain. But now it sounded like a symphony of cosmic rebalancing. Beside him, Shaw completely unraveled. "It was him!" Shaw screamed, tears streaming down his flushed face, pointing his chin at Lawson as Decker moved toward him. "It was his call. He was the senior officer. I didn't want to arrest you, I swear. I just followed his lead. I'm sorry. He made me do it." The cowardice was staggering. A collective murmur of disgust swept through the gallery. Even Captain Monroe looked away, his jaw tightly clenched, utterly sickened by the pathetic display of the men who had sworn an oath to his department. "The time for citing the chain of command was last night, Mr. Shaw," Valerie said, her voice cutting through his hysterical sobbing like a scythe. "When you watched your partner commit battery under the color of law, your duty was to stop him. Instead, you held the flashlight. You are equally culpable. Cuff him, bailiff." Decker secured Shaw's wrists. The two men, previously titans of the rural highways, now stood slouched, weeping, and utterly disgraced. "Captain Monroe," Valerie addressed the commander, "you have your prisoners. Transport them to the county detention center for processing." "And Captain?" Monroe looked up, meeting the judge's eyes. "Process them through the main intake," Valerie instructed, her voice dropping to a terrifyingly soft register. "Just like everyone else." "Yes, Your Honor," Monroe said firmly. He grabbed Lawson by the collar of his pristine Class A uniform, hauling him toward the side door. Decker took Shaw. As the heavy wooden door swung open to lead them out, the gallery could no longer contain itself. The tension snapped. A chaotic roar of conversation, shock, and vindication erupted in the courtroom. Defense attorneys who had seen their clients abused by these exact officers stood up in sheer disbelief. Two local reporters in the back row sprinted out the main doors, their thumbs flying across their phone screens to break the biggest scandal the county had seen in a decade. Valerie struck her gavel once, a sharp, authoritative crack that instantly quelled the noise. "Court is in recess for 15 minutes, she announced. Without waiting for the bailiff's traditional dismissal, Valerie stood up, her black robes billowing around her, and descended the stairs to her private chambers. The moment the heavy oak door of her office clicked shut behind her, the icy facade shattered. Valerie braced her hands against her mahogany desk, leaning forward, as a ragged, exhausted breath tore its way out of her lungs. Her entire body began to tremble. The adrenaline that had sustained her through the night, through the freezing cell, through the meticulous, calculated execution of her courtroom ambush, suddenly evaporated, leaving her hollow and violently tired. She looked down at her wrists. The dark purple bruises were stark against her brown skin, throbbing with a dull, persistent ache. A single tear escaped her eye, tracing a hot path down her cheek. It wasn't a tear of sadness. It was the overwhelming, crushing relief of survival. The door to her chambers creaked open. Samuel Reed slipped inside, locking the door behind him. He had watched the entire proceeding from the gallery, a silent, fiercely proud witness to her storm. Samuel didn't say a word. He walked over to his oldest friend, wrapping his arms around her in a tight, fiercely protective embrace. Valerie let her forehead rest against his shoulder, closing her eyes as the last remnants of the nightmare washed over her. "You did it," Samuel whispered fiercely, his voice thick with emotion. "You gutted them, Val. It was a masterclass." "It shouldn't have to be a masterclass, Sam," Valerie murmured against his suit jacket. "It shouldn't require a judge in disguise to stop two bullies with badges. If I had been anyone else, if I had been a 19-year-old kid coming home from a shift at a diner, I'd still be in that cell. I'd be facing 2 years for felony obstruction." Samuel pulled back, looking her squarely in the eyes. "But you weren't someone else. You were exactly who you are. And because of what you just did out there, Lawson and Shaw will never put their hands on another citizen again." Valerie took a deep, shuddering breath, pulling herself upright. She reached for a tissue on her desk, dabbing her eyes, the steel returning to her spine. She adjusted the collar of her robe. 15 minutes, counselor," Valerie said, her voice steadying into the familiar, unyielding rhythm of the bench. "I have a docket to finish. Justice doesn't stop for a wardrobe change." The fallout was biblical. The story didn't just break the local news, it ignited a national firestorm. By noon that Friday, the dash cam footage from the incident had been leaked to the press. The world watched in horror as a calm, compliant woman in a faded hoodie was violently thrown against a Mercedes-Benz by two grinning deputies, and the world watched in absolute awe as the realization set in that the woman they were abusing was the Honorable Judge Valerie Dawson. But Valerie didn't just stop at Wyatt Lawson and Derek Shaw. She knew that rot of that magnitude didn't grow in isolation. Over the next 6 months, the District Attorney's Public Integrity Unit, spurred by the indisputable evidence and the overwhelming public outcry, launched a massive systemic investigation into the 14th Judicial Circuit's Sheriff's Department. Lawson's personnel file, previously buried under layers of union protection and bureaucratic red tape, was blown wide open. It revealed a horrifying, decade-long pattern of excessive force complaints, racial profiling, and unlawful detentions, almost all of them targeting minorities in low-income neighborhoods. Shaw, eager to save himself, turned state's evidence and testified against his former partner, exposing a localized ring of deputies who routinely bypassed constitutional rights to meet unofficial arrest quotas. The federal government stepped in. The Department of Justice issued a sweeping consent decree, forcing the entire county precinct to undergo top-to-bottom federal oversight, retraining, and structural reform. Several high-ranking officials who had looked the other way for years were forced into early retirement or indicted for obstruction. And then came the day of reckoning. It was a bright, crisp morning in late May. The relentless winter rains were a distant memory, replaced by the brilliant, golden light of early summer. Valerie Dawson sat in the gallery of the Federal District Courthouse. She was not wearing her robes today. She wore a beautifully tailored slate-gray blazer, her hair falling freely around her shoulders. Beside her sat her husband, Dr. William Dawson, holding her hand with a gentle, grounding grip. Across the room, sitting at the defense table in a bright orange Department of Corrections jumpsuit, was Wyatt Lawson. He looked 10 years older. He was gaunt, his hair thinning, the arrogant swagger completely beaten out of him by 6 months in federal holding. He kept his eyes glued to the scuffed wooden table, unable to look anywhere else. Assistant United States Attorney Jessica Rollins stood before the federal magistrate. "Your Honor," Rollins stated clearly. Pursuant to the plea agreement, the defendant, Wyatt Lawson, pleads guilty to 2 counts of deprivation of rights under the color of law and 1 count of aggravated assault. The government recommends a sentence of 84 months in federal prison without the possibility of early parole, alongside a lifetime ban from any form of law enforcement or private security. The federal judge looked over his glasses at Lawson. "Does the defendant understand the terms of this plea?" "Yes, Your Honor," Lawson whispered into the microphone. It was the voice of a ghost. Before passing the sentence, the federal judge looked toward the gallery. "Does the victim wish to make a statement?" Valerie stood up. The entire courtroom went completely silent. She walked slowly to the podium in the center of the aisle. She didn't have notes. She didn't need them. She looked directly at Lawson, forcing him to lift his head and meet her gaze. "8 months ago, Mr. Lawson, you told me that people who aren't hiding anything don't quote laws," Valerie said, her voice echoing with the profound resonance of a woman who had bent the moral arc of the universe toward justice. "You believed that the law was a weapon designed solely for your use, to terrorize those you deemed beneath you. But the law is not a weapon. It is a shield. And it is a mirror." Lawson's lip trembled. He squeezed his eyes shut, a tear slipping down his hollow cheek. "You did not break me that night," Valerie continued, her voice rising, filling the cavernous space. "But you did break the illusion that badges grant immunity from consequence. You are going to a federal penitentiary, not because I was a judge, but because you were a predator. Let your sentence serve as a monument to every officer who thinks the darkness will hide their sins. The light always comes, and the gavel always falls." She stepped away from the podium and walked back to her husband, her head held high, completely unburdened. Later that evening, as the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in brilliant strokes of violet and gold, Valerie drove her husband's Mercedes down Interstate 85. She took the exit for the Old County Line. She pulled into the same Sunoco gas station. It looked different in the dying light of a beautiful spring evening. The menacing shadows were gone. The flickering fluorescent canopy had been repaired, buzzing with a warm, steady glow. She stepped out of the car. She was wearing her comfortable sweatpants and a faded college hoodie. She picked up the pump, selected her fuel, and stood leaning against her car, watching the numbers tick upward. A county sheriff's cruiser pulled into the lot. Valerie's heart didn't spike. She didn't tense up. She calmly watched as the cruiser pulled up to the pump parallel to hers. A young female deputy stepped out. She looked at Valerie, offering a polite, professional nod. "Evening, ma'am," the deputy said, walking inside to grab a cup of coffee. "Beautiful night for a drive." "It really is," Valerie smiled, securing her gas cap with a solid click. She got back into her car, merged onto the highway, and drove home. The universe had tried to strip her of her power in the dark, but it had vastly underestimated the fire she carried within. The next morning, she would put on her black robe. She would ascend the 3 wooden steps to her bench, and she would ensure that in courtroom 4B, the scales of justice never tipped to the dark ever again. If you felt the chills when Judge Dawson's gavel finally dropped on those corrupt deputies, hit that like button right now. This story proves that true power doesn't come from a badge and a gun. It comes from integrity, resilience, and the absolute refusal to be broken by an unjust system. Karma never loses an address, and sometimes it wears a black judicial robe. Share this video with someone who needs to see the scales of justice perfectly balanced, and don't forget to subscribe for more.